Today, I'm talking with John Anderton, who I met in my CEO masterclass back in 2021. John's been recruiting staff offshore to work in his businesses for over 20 years, both by sponsorship of skilled migrants and also direct hire of remote staff in the Philippines. If you're a founder, a team leader, or just someone tired of the hiring grind, you might find this episode eye-opening. John's on a mission through his business Clarke Point to redefine how business owners think about remote teams, not as a cost-cutting compromise, but as a smart, strategic way to build leaner, more profitable businesses. With a diverse background in tech ranging from food manufacturing to tech startups, John brings a clear-eyed perspective on what actually works when hiring offshore and why now is the perfect time to rethink your strategy. This is a topic that's got real currency, particularly as we learned during COVID how effective knowledge workers can be at working remotely. And as I've worked directly and remotely from my clients for over 30 years, it's this that I want to dig into properly. John, welcome.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. So, John, when I talk with my successful business founders and CEOs about this, I find they fall into one of two camps. On the one side, it's a great idea, but it's hard enough managing local staff who don't want to return to work, or the language and the accent barrier is too hard to navigate. Or on the other side, they say, we find it really successful, but there are challenges getting the workflows right and getting the quality on higher value tasks such as engineering, web development, and accounting. I was speaking with an engineer just last week who is seeing a number of the tier one global firms using low-cost remote workers for technical drawings, and frankly, he was pretty unimpressed. On the flip side, another client of mine has had for the last 10 years 30 firmware, software, technology commissioning staff offshore and finds them to be absolutely fantastic. So, John, why should Australian medium businesses be thinking of hiring remote workers, and where can they be the most successful?
Thanks, John. Look, it's a very complex question. The reality is work has separated from location. Now, you see that in your consulting practice, you can work remotely from anywhere.
Yeah.
The reality is that most service-based jobs can actually be done remotely. And in that case, if you're a business in Australia, your talent pool is no longer limited to just the people who can drive to your office. It's actually the global market. And in the global market, yes, there's low-cost talent in other locations. More than that, there's actually global talent. You can actually get better talent offshore than you can in Australia. So you used the example of a designer. We've got a commercial interior designer placed at an organization, and that team has 3 in Australia, 1 offshore, and a design manager in Australia.
Yeah.
And the design manager's favorite designer is the one offshore. Now we're talking a global talent. So the person in the Philippines has got an architecture degree and designed offices for globals like Cushman & Wakefield from Manila into locations like New York and London.
Wow.
And so you can get that sort of global talent, work 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week. The way they describe it is they give him crumbs of nothing and he creates great designs.
Wow.
So I think one of the key challenges is if you're not experienced at doing or managing remote work, it's quite a big learning curve. And this is really for any business. In the old days, people managed staff by, time in chair. They're in the office early, they leave the office late, that's a good worker. But that's not the way you manage people in a knowledge economy. For organizations that can make the shift to managing outcomes and creating roles where you select and onboard staff correctly, they train them, they support them with the right tools, a lot of service-based roles can actually be done better offshore than here. And in the same way that, in the 1970s, if people in Australia had thought, well, I'll manufacture in China versus Australia, they would have laughed at you. But you look at the iPhone, you can't make this in Australia. We don't have remotely the same tools. Now, exactly the same thing is happening with service positions. If you look at B2B marketing, for example, the cutting edge of B2B sales marketing is really quite scientific now. There's amazing tools from sales research assistants to direct cold outreach and data enrichment. In somewhere like the Philippines, you can get the specialists who really know what they're doing in that area. And the quantity of work they deal with is just on another scale. For example, we hired a sales research assistant who was previously working in the US market. She would start work at 8 p.m. her time, send out 12,000 SMS messages. She'd have her lunch break at midnight. And then from those messages, that would generate 8 to 12 referral inbound leads. She would phone them up, qualify them, and then hand them over to a Houston-based sales team. Now, there's nobody in Australia doing 12,000 SMS outbound messages per day. It's just the market's not big enough.
Wow. Yeah. Gosh, that actually sounds amazing. I want to dig into that a lot more, John. But surely there's a lot more to it than when I was on Upwork 8 years ago, looking to hire a developer, for my first version of the organization performance and value framework. It was definitely uncharted territory in those days. It took way longer than I expected, and it required much more project management than I wanted to give it. But in the end, we ended up with a really credible result. So what's the right way to go about it? Because, you hit a nerve when you sort of said there's a mindset and a management style change. I remember 20 years ago when there was a lot of business process outsourcing that was being done to places like India and to the Philippines. And frankly, it was a bit of a mess. But over a sort of a 10-year period, the level of sophistication of management that the big firms were doing actually really helped that become quite a seamless exercise. For a medium-sized business, I guess that's the real question. I mean, how much rejigging and relearning and upskilling do they need to do before they're even capable of doing this properly?
That's a good question. I think there's a couple of issues or items to discuss. One is basically you don't have to start from scratch. So now you can go to somewhere like the Philippines or India or many countries, and you can actually directly hire talent who are already experienced in the Australian market. For example, if you look at accounting, the accounting profession has enormously gone to the Philippines in the last 10 years in Australia. So if you're an accounting firm that hasn't done it before, you can actually just pay a few $100s more per month and go and hire somebody who's already well experienced in accounting in Australia. They know GST, they know payroll, etc.
Yeah.
The first movers or the pioneers, they're not in Philippines anymore. They're in a place like Nepal. And I was talking to a firm that is, they've moved their center of outsourcing to Nepal. Now they hire graduates from a university who know nothing about Australian accounting, and they start from scratch and teach them all.
Yeah.
Their business model obviously supports that level of training and a long investment period before having a productive staff member.
Yeah.
For most of the organizations that I deal with, effectively they get way more return investment by going and hiring a player who's already experienced.
Yeah.
If you look at a country like the Philippines, there's 110 million people. It's a big society. I like to break it down as 3 distinct job markets: the local job market, the American job market, and the Australian job market. And it's kind of exponential in terms of salaries.
Really?
The Australian roles are the cream of the crop. We pay the best. We treat the people very well. They love working Eastern States hours, but you pay more. People that work in the American market, they get exposed to global tools and quantities of, business on a bigger level, but they are working overnight. They're treated in a much more command and control sort of manner. They get extensive procedures and they have to follow that exactly. And they're not, not allowed to kind of think outside the square. And then in the local market, it's really quite a different environment. It's very paternalistic. You get a bag of rice, you get all kinds of sort of works. The salaries in the local market are a fraction of what people who are working in the Australian market earn. Now, we work with our clients strategically to take advantage of that curve. Usually we're starting an Australian business at the higher end because it's easier for the Australian business to basically leverage the talent there. For some specialized tech skills, any sort of global tech platform like HubSpot or whatever, you can get great talent from the American market, but you might have to spend a bit of time onboarding them to the Australian way of working. And Australians, we're very quick to say, they don't understand, or they don't speak good English. But Australians don't think about the fact that we speak English in a particularly strange way. We blur all the words, we run everything together. We talk very generally. We dance around negative news. We kind of hint, well, what would you like to do? And so we have a number of cultural quirks that are quite unique on a global scale. And when you interface with global cultures, from the Australian point of view, we can point the finger, but actually sometimes it's really understanding about what are Australians doing that are different.
Yeah, well, I guess we don't know what we don't know. I mean, I've lived and worked in Chicago for a couple of years and London for sort of 3 years. You cover it's those little things that can really throw off your connection with people. And you're right. I don't think as a culture we're aware of as to how unique and what our nuances are of the way that we manage. In some ways, I think we feel that we're actually quite a bit more laissez-faire. The Americans are very direct and they don't understand this concept of self-deprecating humor. You say to an American, "Oh, look, after 30 years, I don't really know much about this, but here's a brilliant idea." They'll get stuck on the bit about, "Well, after 30 years, you actually didn't know much about it, so why should I listen to you? Fine, tell me about the next good idea."
Yeah.
And I can imagine that if people were used to working in the American culture, then it would be quite fascinating to deal with Australians. I find it fascinating that that as Australians, we would be culturally attuned to paying more. That's interesting.
Well, actually, we quite often come across a situation where Australians start to become very generous to their, for example, Filipinos, and they give them pay rise every year. And sometimes, occasionally, we find they're paying them the same as what they pay people in Australia. And I think there's this sort of maybe an egalitarianism aspect where the Australian employer wants to treat them the same. It's got a few complications in its own. It does set up problems in the future where they can't ever possibly replace that income. But there's also, the reality is Australian employers just don't have expectations as high as people in the American market. And the American market will chop and change way faster. We typically work with organizations looking to create good long-term roles. One of the reasons, I have offshore to India, you can get great talent there. I don't use it as a primary market. I find the time zone quite difficult. I find also that if you've got great people there, if you don't give them a big pay rise every year, they will leave. And if they stay after 5 years, you're paying them an Australian salary. So I find staff retention a challenge in that market. And then you have the sort of cultural issues as well. For someone like the Philippines, they have a sort of shared cultural Christian heritage. I'm not sure if you've come across the Hofstede cultural dimensions. It's a classic IVM. It's like 50 years old, and it's a way of comparing different cultures. And the Australian and Filipino culture, it actually, for 5 and 6 dimensions, are actually pretty close.
Right.
The one dimension they're very different is power distance. Australians expect their subordinates and superiors to be pretty close to level, whereas the Filipino culture expects quite a high power distance. So a power distance is referring to things like, do you talk back to your boss in a meeting in front of other people? If your boss tells you to do something stupid, you just go and do it. Now, as an Australian, we're offended by those ideas. This also goes to that experience that some people have offshoring. What a lot of the offshoring companies, they'll hire people in the local market who have no experience with the Australian culture, and then price them for the Australian market, and they'll pocket the difference. And the Australian companies get frustrated because they're unhappy with the quality, and they can't understand why they feel like there's no initiative for the people, but they're not thinking about the fact that actually they've hired somebody who's come from probably a schooling in a university and a work career where they're taught to kind of stay within the boundaries. Now, you can actually create life-changing roles for people in that market. For example, we hired for a technology company, we hired someone to man their Zendesk or their help desk system.
Yeah.
And it was just email support. So for candidates, we just assessed their written English. And generally, written English is great in Philippines. And we hired this talent. So she was very good technically and very good on the written English.
Mm.
After a few months, we found actually we'd hired a real brain there. She was really super smart. So she got promoted, and then, she actually doubled her income pretty quickly, and then doubled her income again to become a leader. Now, her spoken English, how do you say this? Her ability to understand the way Australians slur words was not great, but you can spend $200 and send them to a face-to-face English speaking course in the Philippines, and you can address that. And anyway, so you've got this amazing woman doing great things. The language can be learned over a period of time, but for her, her income quadrupled in the space of about 9 months. And that means moving to a better area. Her kids go to a better school. she has more stable electricity, and really a better life for the whole family. And in return, you have a really loyal, happy person.
Are you looking to pinpoint the areas that will make the biggest impact on your business? Check out the Organisation Performance and Value Diagnostic. This powerful tool lets you evaluate your business on multiple facets and provides email reminders to keep you on track. Head over to CriticalFewActions.com.au and get started now. So where does it actually make sense to remote source the employees? I mean, you've talked actually about some of the high value tasks, and most people sort of think about the low value tasks. And frankly, I'm not sure they even know how to gauge what's high, low, medium, or whatever. And is that even the right construct to be thinking about?
Yeah, exactly right. And what I find is that the organizations doing it the best are kind of completely re-engineering their business and rethinking it from the ground up. That's probably the way I got into it, primarily offshore, where my business model was not working in Australia. I had to offshore. I ended up saving $1 million a year off my payroll. But what I didn't realize when I started was that you can actually increase quality as you do it. Now, there's definitely a learning curve involved. We made plenty of mistakes. Don't get me wrong with that.
Because, I mean, the reality is, in your former business model, you used to bring in quite a number of skilled migrants, help them with their visa application process. It's not an inexpensive process to go through. And I guess to a degree it can be a bit hit and miss, particularly around things such as, have I got the right person actually inbound? And also, how do I retain them after they've gone through the PR process?
Yeah, exactly right. So for 20 years, I've sponsored people in from offshore, most corners of the earth, South Africa, Europe, most countries, Asia, Americas, North and South. Basically, to me, it's getting very expensive and very high risk. You can spend 12 to 20 grand sponsoring and helping somebody move here. And then literally they can take a job the next day and there's nothing you can do about that. The government has specifically set it up that way. Yeah. And most of the cost is government taxes, which is amazing. But you just don't have to. You can actually get that talent directly offshore. And, a lot of people want to work in the Australian market and not physically be here. I mean, people that work in Bali, but for, Australians working remote from Bali, for example, can have a really great quality of life. If they can earn Australian income, then they're laughing.
Yeah. So you were talking about re-engineering the business model. Tell me a bit more about that, because the command and control doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly right. So I'm going to talk to you about an example, and I've changed up the details. This is a real Melbourne business. So business owners working 50 hours a week, stressed, scraping by, trying to make it work with Australian employees. It basically cracked it. Now, he started with an executive assistant offshore. He started basically recording Loom videos about every aspect of his business operation. It took him maybe a year to completely re-engineer the entire business. So think marketing agency, and I'll try and keep it abstract to protect the anonymity.
Protect the innocent, yep.
So he's got a B2B sales and marketing team. They research prospects. They, for the organizations, they identify the key contact. They get their details. They create outbound campaigns, and it's very sharp the way they do it. They create scarcity, and it's very smart. That generates appointments with key decision makers. Now, the guy in Australia does those appointments because he's best at selling.
Yeah.
But when he turns up to the meeting, somebody else has done the research. They use AI note takers to record the meeting. Afterwards, someone offshore prepares the paperwork and, sends out the contract, and it all looks like it's coming from him, but it's all the actual work's done offshore. The clients, there's follow-up and there's closing, etc. And then all the work is done offshore. So you've got one person in Australia and 20 people overseas. Wow. So off $1 million of revenue, you're talking $600,000 of profit. You're talking a business owner who works maybe 6 hours a week. You're talking growing at 20% per annum. Now, in that space, he can invest so much more in marketing than his competitor. You think of a similar size agency, they wouldn't be able to afford 20 staff. Maybe they'd have 5 or 6. Maybe they'd have an office. They're worried about fair work claims. Superannuation goes up in July. they're barely sort of staying afloat in that same revenue that the other person is able to grow at 20% per annum. Now, the business I'm talking about, they've got their sales model down to such a scientific degree that he's literally pointing in the US market now. And that's where, he can go global. And what's a better business? A little office in Melbourne with 5 people and you're kind of drowning in overheads, or you're working a couple of hours here and there and you're building a global business.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now we're taking those ideas into really businesses that you wouldn't have thought of.
Yeah.
Commercial air conditioning installation companies.
Say a bit more about that, because I mean that's metal bashing and installation and construction.
Yeah, that's right. But if you think about it as a business, you've still got to quote jobs and you've still got to project manage things and you've still got to do the bookkeeping. So, the model there is for every high value person in Australia having an offshore assistant. And when I say assistant, I'm not talking an administration assistant. I mean someone that could do their role offshore to be their basically number one. So, the estimator having an estimator offshore, the draftsman having a draftsperson overseas, the office manager having a full-time bookkeeper overseas. So they're not intending to reduce their headcount in Australia. They're intending to turbocharge their growth by leveraging the Australian people. Did something similar for a commercial property management company where they struggle to find staff in Australia. It's a complex role. Shopping centers, 60 shopping centers.
Yeah.
We helped basically hire back office talent. Now, accounts payable, easy. We had 1,057 applicants. They also had a role called property accountant. So in shopping centers, basically the commercial leases are, they've got a few quirks. For example, you've got rent-free periods or contributions, but also you had turnover rent. So if you make too much money, the shopping center takes a chunk of it. And the software they use is called Yardi. So in Australia, there's just not many people that know how to use it. Now, the client didn't think we'd find anyone offshore with experience of that. Actually, we found somebody over there with 12 years experience managing 100 commercial properties for a Brisbane company, very knowledgeable about Yardi. In fact, when her prior company moved to it, she flew to Brisbane and quality controlled the data migration into Yardi. So, she knows it backwards.
Yeah.
You can't, it's very hard to find that talent in Australia, maybe for $180,000, $200,000 a year. In the Philippines, without talking out of turn, you're not paying about $60,000 Australian for that role, but you're getting someone who's very good, very experienced. Now, most people, when they think offshoring, they're not thinking about paying 60,000 Australian dollars.
No, they're not. And actually, you hit an important point there. And there is also almost a mindset issue around perceived value. We start out with our mindset that, if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. And therefore, if you're not paying much, then you're not expecting much in the way of skill. And there's also, I think, part of the Australian ethos is this, this issue of, is this fair and am I taking advantage? And I think that sort of stops people thinking about, okay, high value skilled employees that aren't being paid Australian-based wages. It just doesn't compute. And so therefore they probably actually don't even think that that's a real opportunity. But it sounds like, what you're seeing is you're getting outstanding skill, probably better than may be available locally, certainly more affordable, but perhaps who've actually got far more international experience, which is something that we may not be able to actually tap as talent anyway. So, John, you were talking about physiotherapists and how they were managing lead generation the other day. Can you tell me a bit more about how they looked at their customer service model?
So he would find physiotherapists, and then he had a repeatable sales process which generated an appointment and closed them. Now, initially he was selling basically monthly retainers, which is quite a hard sales cycle.
Yeah.
And so then he switched it to basically charging for new patient appointments, which is a much easier sales pitch to a clinic because you only pay if we get your reward. And he knew his model, he could generate the new appointments. And then it got to the point where he was sending so many leads, but the clinics are taking those leads as inbound phone calls, and the receptionists are not really, they're not
skilled
trained salespeople. So that was losing conversion. So what he did is actually, the equivalent, and I'm using an analogy here, but the equivalent of hired physiotherapists in the Philippines actually take the phone call. And so it's quite easy to find physiotherapists with good English and then sort of train them on your sales approach. And if you're a potential buyer, you're a new customer in Australia, and you phone up and you're talking to somebody who is an expert in your area, then your rate of conversion is actually higher. And in terms of the physiotherapist in the Philippines, working as an inbound phone call center operator, basically, is actually, it might pay 3 or 4 times as much as working as a physiotherapist in the Philippines.
Yeah.
So they can have a great life. They can do it from home. And they're winning. You pay for them to do some sales training, and you have that model worked out, and you're really, as an agency, you're controlling the whole end-to-end experience of the customer, and the customers are getting what they want, which is new bookings, and they're not having to learn inbound sales approaches.
Yeah.
It's an idea where you use talent offshore, highly specialized, highly trained, and you deliver a higher quality experience. Now, what happens if a competitor agency walks into that clinic and starts trying to sell a monthly retainer? Good luck.
Yeah, because they're offering up an old model. People
You've got black and white, and
they want to pay for outcomes, not inputs. It's that simple.
Now, if you've got a plumbing company and you need to quote work, you're not looking for the average Manila plumber. You're looking for a plumber who's maybe done a certification or an MBA or something, and they're definitely out there.
Yeah. I'm thinking about my client, Tommy. He's got a team of 30 in the Far East. One of the things that his business does is install technology systems into high-rise buildings. And the way those technology systems is designed and configured is very complex, when you're trying to manage the building systems, energy, water consumption, water treatment, all that sort of stuff. And they found that, they've been able to hire really talented people who already understand those systems in remote locations. And then by buddying them up with their local engineers, almost as a one-on-one team, the remote resource, doesn't really matter where they are, has been able to augment their local talent in a way that's better than just it's a lower cost resort, but more from the point of view of their turnaround time, because their time zones were opposite. So therefore they're effectively getting 24-hour coverage.
Yeah.
They're actually getting much more effective attention to detail when doing takeoffs on building plans and so on. And when it was coming to actually the programming of these systems, they're getting massive gains simply because they could throw more resource at the problem faster and get to workable solutions much more quickly. And there was a cost benefit. But also, they had the sense that they felt that they were making a major contribution to other people's lives.
Yeah, look, I agree with all of that. I think starting with the contribution point, one of my team members, she actually gave birth a week before we interviewed her for the job. Now, we gave her the job. She started work a week later, and she was actually basically filling in for a maternity leave role in Australia, and she had a 2-week-old child. Now, she turned out to be one of the best project managers I've ever come across in my career. She is so grateful that we gave her a job. It's a matriarchal culture. She may be the biggest breadwinner in her extended family, and often the grandparents come look after the babies. But the opportunity that we gave her, really good. Another time, if your organization is big enough to support multiple roles and you have hired people from the local market, then you're really uplifting the entire family. And we regularly get stories of people basically so grateful because no one would give them a job because of their spoken English, but maybe their technical skill was great, and then you talk to them for 6 months and they can understand our accent. But going back to your comment about one person in Australia, one person offshore, I personally think that's a really good thing. And if businesses aren't doing that, they're maybe leaving an opportunity behind. But then looking at how it grows, one person here, 2 people offshore, 3 people offshore, 20 people offshore. I'm starting to see businesses that are really able to run rings around their competitors because they can do an overwhelming quality of work and quantity of work and really fast by Australian standards. If you look at something like the adoption of AI, Australian businesses tend to be pretty slow at adopting that. And it's kind of, quite a significant thing to get the Australian employees to embrace it. Whereas a place like the Philippines, they adopt it very well. And so you can bring that into your organization. And, I'm talking about using AI right through your sales process and right through your customer engagement and, every aspect of your operations. And so if you do need to retrain and cross-train staff, it's better to do that at a third the price than, taking your Australian staff.
Okay, so it sounds like the business case is pretty compelling. There's a social contribution, there's an efficiency gain, there's an output gain, there's potentially a 24-hour clock that works for us, and there's access to potentially as good, if not superior, talent. But I think there's still a few wrinkles that are coming out of Fair Work Australia, addressing conditions and wage rates and so on. Can you bring me up to speed on that? Because it's going to be a big issue for the unwitting.
Yeah, so most Australian companies don't realise if they directly engage a contractor overseas, there's a high chance they're at risk of Fair Work deeming that relationship to be an Australian employee. A lot of Australians don't talk about it, unaware that also they're probably breaching, for example, Philippine employment law as well.
Really?
So yeah, direct engagement of a contractor in the Philippines. If you do day-to-day management and you pay them directly, then that, basically the critical issue here is employee versus contractor. And people are aware that the fair work regulators in Australia are quite aggressive in pushing forward to try and deem contractors to be employees. And there was a critical case late last year where an offshore contractor in the Philippines took an Australian law firm to Fair Work, and the law firm basically said they're not a employee, they're a contractor, and they're overseas. And then the Fair Work, I forget the name of the title, but the member or the judge or the person assessing the case, deputy commissioner or it's quite someone senior, I think, basically then went right through the definition of employee and actually, what you call the relationship doesn't matter. You can call it a contractor, but if it looks like an employee, then you've got a lot of risks. There's other things too. Where did you make the offer? If a foreigner comes to Australia and you give them an employment contract and then they leave Australia and then they work for you, they're still captured under Australian employment law.
Yeah.
Now, in Clarke Point, we have an offshore company that acts in between. So we are the responsible entity. And so we're contracting services to the Australian business, and then we're engaging with the people in the Philippines. And we've got basically lawyers in Philippines and Australia that assess it. The case is quite interesting, but I mean, it's obviously it's a problem. I mean, there's businesses in Australia directly engage 150 contractors in the Philippines. And for those businesses, the risk of past claims it's an existential threat to the entire business.
Absolutely. I mean, we know exactly the challenges you have if you underpay staff in cafes in Melbourne.
Yeah, that's right. And no one's talked about superannuation yet, but it's on the agenda.
Yeah.
The reality is we have a lot of companies that directly engage offshore contractors, actually bring them to us to work within our structure to ensure compliance.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time as there was that lawyer case where the offshore person was successful, there was another case with, I think it was National Australia Bank, and it was the Indian person. And that case was thrown out. Now, and a huge part of it was the fact that there was actually a company offshore in between the two. And in that case, it was a subsidiary of National Australia Bank. But there's all kinds of other traps by directly engaging as well. I know of a company that basically employed people in Bali, and that went along fine until the Indonesian tax authorities knocked on their door, audited them, and basically said, from a transfer pricing point of view, you're paying the Indonesian company the cost of the workers, but you should be attributing additional money equivalent to the profit that they're generating for their work. Now, there's not many Australian companies thinking about, in a small, medium business space, thinking about transfer pricing.
No.
But if you start doing multinational sort of operations, it's a factor. Now, in a strange coincidence, my graduate role as an economist, I happen to work at PricewaterhouseCoopers in transfer pricing. But it's just one of those quirks. So there's definitely minefields, but there's also opportunities. What I find, a Melbourne company moved their contractors under our management last week, and they just wanted their people to be looked after, and they know about health insurance, for example, and simple things like that. But we can also value add. We provide other services too, to make sure that the people are happy and the Australian company's happy, and then they're able to hire A players, and sort of demystify the market a bit, because, I find a lot of the sort of horror stories are really more learning experiences on the curve of offshoring. You referred to the outsourcing or the Upwork sort of project-based
Yeah.
stuff. Now, the reality is a heck of a lot of IT projects blow out and take a lot longer, whether that's Australia or offshore.
Yeah.
And I would say most digital projects, it's a project management that is their problem. And then if you've got a non-technical founder who's directly hired people, embedded in that choice is a lot of decisions that they don't realize, and they won't see the consequences of for years to come. But you can do it, and you can learn a lot from it. And yes, if you sort of do it yourself, it might take you a few years to get the right team together, but it's very transformational for the organization. I personally feel, and this goes to the naming of my business, I think we've crossed the point where it's not just feasible anymore. Now it's mandatory, and it's a bit of a race. I personally think AI for most businesses will make a 30 to 40% improvement or change their business. But I think offshoring will make 300%, offshoring of service-based roles make 300% difference.
Okay, so let's unpack that, because I'm thinking immediately about my client base of medium-sized businesses. All of them want to be able to deliver fantastic work for their clients. They want to have a cohesive, co-supportive team that they work with, and they want to treat them well, and they want to sleep well at night too. So a triad, it's almost nirvana. And if they're going to go down this path, how would they go about doing that? What would be the key steps that they would do to augment and transform their business? Take me through that. What's the life cycle?
Yeah, so it really kind of depends on how sophisticated they are in terms of managing staff on an outcomes basis. If they are well set up from that, they've got good established procedures and they can onboard new staff and they can work well, then maybe it's a question of how well can they do remote. And if they're an organization that has forced people into the office, then they can experiment with that with Australian staff. And as they become more competent about it and work through the issues that arise, then they can start, basically, if people leave, they can replace them with people offshore. Or you can, try. I often like organizations to get an executive assistant for the CEO or business owner offshore first. And that can be good as a leadership for the organization. But also it helps because I like the leader to get a superstar EA. And a superstar EA is transformational for the business leader. And then they can kind of see the possibilities that are available. And then when they see Australian staff, might be sales staff spending 30% of the time doing admin, you can start augmenting teams by putting an assistant into the teams and then maybe more one-to-one. I think bringing in outside consultants, for example, there's a great AI trainer that I often introduce into organizations, and he can help people kind of figure out how to use AI. And you can do that collectively with your teams. Managing outcomes, I kind of like the book, Why Work Sucks. I'm not sure if you've read that one. It's really kind of trying to shift to an outcome-based management model. That's in the context of a retail shop.
Yeah.
But, there's also HR experts that you can engage to help work through those issues. And obviously, if there's sort of larger scale moving of teams offshore, then there's the redundancy side of things through as well. Realistically, I think it takes 1 to 2 years to change a medium-sized business to really embrace offshore. And on the other side of it, there'll be a very different organization.
Yeah, brilliant. So John, are there any other gotchas that we need to be aware of?
I think there's a lot. Yeah, so where to start? I mean, so some people I think fall into the trap of being distrustful of their offshore people, and you can get software that takes photos of their faces every 5 minutes. Now, we don't do any of that. And in fact, basically, I mean, the analogy I tell people when they bring it up is, would you work under that circumstance?
No.
And if you don't give trust, you're not going to get trust back.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say do this with your eyes closed. I mean, if you give your bank passwords offshore, then, you're about to encounter some learnings. But simple things, for example, in an Australian context, a proper business has a separation of authority. So the person who schedules the bank transfers doesn't have authority to approve them. And, there's ways of solving all of these problems. I think the biggest thing is the mindset. I was in a business recently and, their mindset is, if the people aren't in front of me working, how do I know they're working? It's like, okay, that's actually a really good question. And it's going to take you a big mindset shift to move past that. But if you do, your business will be in such a better position in Australia, offshore, whatever. But that is really the key. Do you know what good output or good outcomes from the roles is? Can you define it? Can you teach people? Can you measure it?
Yeah.
And if you can't, maybe just measuring quality by time in chair is, maybe it's easy for you, but it's not
Well,
really.
it's fallacious because anyone can sit in a chair. I mean, I've seen in large organisations people turning up at 7:30 in the morning, they leave at 7 o'clock at night, and the reality is they were doing that because they wanted their boss to see them either be there before them or be there after them. It had nothing to do with the fact that their work efficiency was poor, to say the best. And they were clearly focused on the wrong things. They weren't focused on getting the right outcome and getting the job done. And that's a very 70s mindset.
Yeah.
So interesting. John, this really does open up, a whole bevy of opportunities. It's fascinating when you think about, just 3 weeks ago, we had a conversation with Mark Cameron talking about artificial intelligence. And we were talking about, how will your business be different when your carbon-based workforce is outnumbered by your silicon-based workforce 3-1. And, AI has certainly got the potential to dramatically augment the efficiency and the work output of a business. But then when you have the capacity to bring in very highly skilled resources that you may not have access to in Australia, or you may not be able to afford in Australia, both of those things, then add that to AI, and that creates a business of exponential capacity, scale, and leverage.
Definitely. And I think medium business has really been smashed by governments in Australia. Have had a hard time. I think the combination of offshoring and AI can sort of bring it back, and medium-sized businesses can move a lot faster than big business. So I think it's an opportunity to be taken advantage of.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally agree. And as I myself use some offshore resources for a bunch of things. And as you say, it is a learning curve, but it gives you capacity that you would not normally be able to afford. But what I see the real opportunity is the access to the talent pool that we may not be able to have here. And if we can augment our existing workforce here, then that really will have an exponential change to our business. So are there any other things that we need to think about when we're talking about this?
I think being open to questioning absolutely everything. Australians tend to be generalists because of the high cost of labor.
Yeah, we have to do everything.
Yeah, people come to me like, I'd like them to do my inbox management and do social media marketing and all my invoicing, plus also do this specialized other software, plus this. And that's just not the way that the world works. Oftentimes.
And it kills people, it absolutely drowns them in those 75 things that they've got to do to run their business.
Exactly right. And if you as a business, let's just say you've got a 20-year employee who does those things, then as a business, you're massively at risk, because if you ever lose that person, firstly, it's going to be quite hard to replace that knowledge, and you might need to replace one person with 3 or 4, and then you've got no one to train them. Whereas if you organize your business well and it's sort of more specialized and you can tap into specialized talent, then you can really restructure for explosive growth.
Yeah, excellent. So, John, coming to the final question, if a founder or a CEO of a medium business is looking to start hiring remote team members into their organization, what critical few actions should they start tomorrow if they did nothing else?
Well, obviously I'm always available for a free chat. I think exploring the different ways that you can use it for your current structure, and that's, within the mindset of your organizational structure that you've currently got, and the roles that you've currently got. Think about the different countries and the implications of the cultural and time zone differences to find a good match for what the roles you're trying to do. We're doing a lot in South Africa at the moment, but then start to be really push the boundaries on your thinking. If you had a blank piece of paper to enter your industry, what would be a way that you would do it, using as much AI, as much offshore? How can you really change the paradigm? What are the pain points in the industry that you could really kind of re-engineer your service delivery to achieve, and really kind of really push your thinking, and then be prepared to invest a couple of years to figure it out, because it's very worthwhile to do.
Well, it's a major strategic play to have a sustainable competitive advantage. And if you're not doing it, somebody else will be.
100%.
If you really want to kick off your strategic planning and work in a supportive environment with other CEOs and leaders, the CEO Masterclass in Strategic Planning and Implementation is for you. This 10-month small group course helps you craft your strategic plan, present it to a group of peer investors, and develop a habit of monthly implementation. Our waitlist is open now at CriticalFewActions.com.au. And so, while we're talking about outcomes for our customers, can you tell me a little bit about how you found the CEO Masterclass that you did with me during COVID?
Yeah, look, I think it was really great. Thanks, John. So obviously during COVID, we were all a bit isolated in Melbourne, and it was good to come together with other business owners and sort of get out of the day-to-day. I think, one of the biggest learnings for me is the business I was in at that time, I struggled to articulate the competitive advantage of how we were different. And that, being there with other people, like Carl from Barclay Smokehouse, who I still see today, they articulated theirs very, very clearly, and it immediately positioned them well. And I think it was something they could build on quite dramatically. And that's something I've taken into my, into Clarke Point, where, for example, a lot of our competitors are focused on price point, but we're focused on quality and return on investment for our clients. And we're kind of doing it quite differently in that regard. And it's really kind of resonating.
And how did it change you as a CEO?
I'm not sure how to answer that one. It's kind of, I think the pandemic in general had a bit of I think it accelerated a lot of changes all at once. Previously I had all my staff on site in front of me, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the energy of it. I enjoyed the buzz. In Melbourne, due to lockdowns, you were allowed to do it. And then in the space I was in, the staff didn't want to come back in the office. And so you had to kind of adjust to that new reality. And I think I'm now on the other side of that, where I recognize that it is a new reality. And now it's how do I position to take advantage of that, as opposed to reminisce about what it was or try and somehow pretend that life hasn't moved forward.
Yeah, it was actually, I think in a lot of ways, a very helpful catalytic event to force us to actually step up and completely revisit and reinvigorate our business models from what was something that probably hadn't changed in 50 or 100 years.
I agree. And to be honest, so I'm from Perth, and when I'm talking to businesses in Perth, I actually think it's an area that Melbourne could have a strategic advantage, because we went through it, we figured out how the best players will take this competitive advantage, and have dramatically lower costs and be able to provide dramatically higher quality, and simultaneously invest more money in marketing and acquiring new customers. So I think the businesses in sort of Western Australia or Queensland that were not, weren't impacted anywhere nearly as much, they're living under a paradigm that's no longer relevant.
Yeah, I think that's actually really insightful. I hadn't thought about that in that way, because I guess I'm a bit myopic from the point of view that, I saw COVID, frankly, as a gift. It had its costs in it and created massive challenges, but it forced us to be very adaptable. And you're right, the rest of the country really didn't have that maximum force change imposed on them. And I think you're right, it does provide us with a regional strategic advantage.
Definitely. And I think for someone like yourself, it's you were already working remotely for a long time. Yeah, my business is named after a quote from Arthur C. Clarke, who envisaged in the 60s that there'd come a time where you could do your work just as easily from Bali as from Edinburgh. We've crossed that point. We're there. When I go into a business that forces their staff to come in every day, and they're doing jobs that could so easily be offshored, all I see is overhead. I see the cost of the rent and, all the expenses that come with that. And then, paying their staff 3 times as much, and all of the additional costs that come from payroll expense, which is often the biggest cost.
Yeah.
Like they're really at risk, because a competitor can come in, underprice them, and actually deliver better quality.
Yeah, I remember, my client with the offshore resources when he was bringing his 160 staff back into the office around the country, and there was quite a lot of resistance. But the simple reality was that for those people who were very resistant, because they were able to work very effectively remotely, were really actually demonstrating for us how effectively the work could be done remotely. And so therefore, if it couldn't be done in Mulgrave or it couldn't be done in St Albans, then it could easily be done in Manila or South Africa or Nigeria.
100%.
And that's what started to happen.
Yeah. I think this is going to be a real force for improving the standard of living in other countries, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. John, as always, it's been an absolute delight to chat with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, John. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Few Actions podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and grab the downloadables from the show notes. And if you found this episode helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you share it with your peers and your team. Stay focused and take action. The Critical Few Actions podcast, including show notes and links, provides general information only and is not individualised business advice, nor can it be relied upon as such. You must take responsibility for your own advice, decisions, and actions.